Hello, my name is Julie Ty. I'm president of the New York League of Conservation Voters. I am joined here today by Dr. Ed Gerber, a mathematics and ocean science professor at the Quran Institute at New York University. Dr. Gerber specializes in the circulation of the atmosphere, both its natural variability and how it responds to anthropogenic forcing. Today, we'll be discussing the Build Back Better Act and climate change. I hope this discussion shows you why we need to act on climate and get the Build Back Better Act passed now. So where are we? The Build Back Better Act passed the House last fall and is now being negotiated in the Senate. While the process may be messy, we're still fighting to get this bill passed because we know just how important it is for the future of the United States. After the Senate votes on the bill, any changes they make will then be reviewed by the House one more time, and the House will have to vote on the bill again before it's put on the president's desk to be signed into law. From 2010 to 2020, New York experienced 31 extreme weather events, costing up to $100 billion in damages. The Build Back Better framework will set the United States on a course to meet its climate targets, a 50 to 52% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2005 levels by 2030, which will help us to reduce the impacts of climate change as we've seen over the last 10 years. With over $550 billion in total climate action investments, it will be the largest investment in American history for a clean energy economy across buildings, transportation, industry, electricity, agriculture, and climate smart practices in our lands and waters. Build Back Better will create good paying union jobs, grow domestic industries, and advance environmental justice. It will also create a new civilian climate corps that will enlist a diverse generation of New Yorkers in conserving our public lands, bolstering community resilience, and addressing the changing climate, all while putting good paying union jobs within reach. In our clean energy and other sectors, Build Back Better will also strengthen domestic manufacturing and supply chains for critical goods, benefiting American businesses, workers, consumers, and communities. And this is our chance to pass transformative agenda. So with that as a backdrop, I want to thank you for joining us today, Dr. Gerber. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got into the science and the work that you do?
I guess as a kid, I've always been fascinated by weather and the outdoors. I remember whenever it snowed, I would just love to be out there until I was blue in the face. And I was also really good at math. Math, kind of a math geek growing up. And it was really when I was at university and trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life, and I was about to graduate, that I started realizing that the math plays an important role in climate prediction and climate. And I could kind of do really cool things, the things I love. It actually started with, I just found there was a professor who was studying glaciers with mathematical equations. I'm like, that just sounded like the most amazing thing I could do, study glaciers. And I ended up going more into the atmospheric science. But it's partly just a love of the earth. I'm just excited by it, but also a chance to use what I feel like my strengths were in math and physics.
Very exciting. As glaciers seem to get everybody sort of thinking about climate change and how much they've been changing. What has been your biggest takeaway from the research that you've been conducting?
Well, yeah, so my research, I really try to understand the circulation of the atmosphere. And I realize what I mean by that is weather systems like the jet stream. A lot of my work has been doing, how does a jet stream vary? Why are some winters colder than others? And then how is it going to change in a future climate? And I'd say my contributions have been really to understand how important it is to get that natural variability when we're trying to make a model that's to simulate climate at the end of this century. It tells us, well, one, it's the impacts are often be felt through that variability. And the second is it's actually a test of a good climate model. If a model can predict the natural variability we see today, we have more confidence that it'll make better projections in the future.
Well, that's certainly very important to make sure that we have good projections, because right now, like we keep the projections keep evolving. So the threat of climate change has become more and more apparent each year. What do you think needs to be done at the federal level for us to address this?
Well, the main thing is we really have to reduce there's two things. We have to mitigate climate change. That's about reducing our emissions. It really boils down to using less fossil fuels. There's other things, land use comes into this as well. And then the federal government is really the one player that has the power to do that. It's a collective action thing that even if one state takes away its emissions and they just move to another state, we haven't really solved the problem. Another part is that we do need to prepare for climate change. The climate has changed. We've already committed to some. So there's an adaptation part or resilience part. And a good chunk of the bill is actually making sure that we're prepared for the changes. You mentioned the extreme events that we've been seeing over the last over the last 10 years. Some of the big impacts are going to be sea level rise. That's New York City is very vulnerable, Long Island, but also changes in extreme precipitation, which is hitting the entire state. So we need to be prepared for that. So it's a two-prong. I'd say it's most of it is let's mitigate climate change. Let's make it less bad. Let's do our part to save the planet. The other part is saying, let's be realistic. We have to be ready for what happens.
That makes sense. And obviously we saw this year, with Henri followed immediately by Ida, the very different impacts they can have in places that aren't necessarily expecting to flood, right? We saw inland flooding with that. And certainly that's a big issue in upstate New York, where there's been a lot of flooding from extreme storms, sort of like your Irene and Lee, that were much more impactful upstate. What from your angle can people at home do to help combat climate change?
Well, yeah, and I'm going to give this, but I want to start by saying that I think there's almost been an overemphasis on personal responsibility, because it's kind of like, it almost makes us feel guilty, like, oh, every time I make a decision, like, oh, am I doing it? And it's really a collective action program that, I don't have much control over where I get my electricity or how my community is planned. Of course, we can make a difference, and we should. And the way I do that is just looking at where are your biggest impacts. I live in New York City, so I don't have a car. I have a smaller apartment for my family, so I'm not using my emissions there, but I tend to travel, especially for work. And those flights were a huge climate impact. So that for me, it was I really had to realize that being more judicious in what conferences I go to, making sure I'm not saying don't travel, but for me that was what I had to do. But I really think there's almost been an overemphasis on personal responsibility. It kind of makes it hard, like it's somehow our fault for climate change. When a lot of the decisions are beyond our control, at least individual control. As a country, we have control here. And that's why I really think that it really is a federal issue and a state issue.
That is true. We need, well, I view it as we need all of the above, but the biggest actions and changes will come from having government action, and in particular, having the whole country take action will make a huge difference in a way that, states like New York are leading, but we can't do it alone.
Yep.
So with that frame in mind, how do you see Build Back Better Act fitting into the overall strategy of combating climate change?
Okay, yeah. So again, the biggest part is reducing emissions, right? Less CO2. And so on that respect, you could say, well, why do we need to reduce emissions? And this is where the science comes in, and it's our job. And it's not just me. It's really, there's tens of thousands of people working on this. It's a big group effort. But what we do is we have these climate models. These are how we make projections, sort of scenarios. So if we have so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, what will the temperature be, in 10 years and 50 years and 100 years? Okay, and what we do is, as a scientist, we can't predict the future in terms of emissions, but we can say, well, if business continues as usual, and we just keep on ramping up emissions, we expect the planet to be 5 degrees warmer by the end of the century, Celsius, which means 10 degrees Fahrenheit. It would be really, I don't think it'd be an exaggeration to say that would be catastrophic for at least the way we live today. But we do other scenarios where we say, okay, well, how about if we reduce emissions more quickly? And we can kind of map out. And it turns out really, it's just every emission counts, right? And so if we can use less of them, and what we've done is we've targeted scenarios that would reduce the impact of climate change. So that the warming would be ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius was the target from the Paris Accord. Maybe 2 degrees might be more realistic, just given we've committed to a lot. So what you do is you start from that and you say, okay, if we can get our emissions down to this level, our climate models predict this will be the increase in temperature, and we find it acceptable. And so that gives us a target for emissions. And that target means we've got to reduce our emissions by a lot. I think Build Back Better is we're aiming for 52% reduction from 2005 levels. And so that the Build Back Better is mainly targeted at reaching that emission target, right? How do you do that? Emissions come from really, I think sort of the big three are transportation, energy, right? Electricity, but also heating your home. And then often it's called industry, but I like to call it stuff. Because I find with my college students, when I talk about industry, they think, oh, it's some rich person building a factory somewhere else, and they don't realize, no, it's all the stuff we use, right? My smartphone, this jacket, everything. So we have to target all three of those areas. And I think that the first one and the easiest one to target is actually energy production, and that's where a lot of Build Back Better goes after. We need clean energy. We have to get definitely away from coal, but even natural gas is not climate friendly. It's climate friendlier, but it's not good for the planet. So a lot of that is really trying to reduce emissions there. Then on the transportation sector, it's harder because the power plants, there's not so many of them, right? We can control those. Cars, it's distributed. There it's really building up an electric car infrastructure, right? So we can get away from fossil fuels there. That's only useful if we have clean energy. So you got to get the clean energy first. And then there's a lot of incentive there for on the industry side of moving towards less carbon intensive production, right? And that includes food. Food's a big agriculture. I mean, it is a big part of this as well. No, so that's a big chunk of build back better. Build back better. And then the other part, again, I think there's about 100 million of climate resilience in education. So this is, again, preparing for the changes that we're already seeing today, so that we can mitigate, we can adapt, so that storms don't become worse. And one thing I know in New York City that we're particularly vulnerable to is the sea level rise. Right, like Hurricane Sandy just devastated the city. It had a 3-meter storm surge, so there's extra 3 meters of water, and it flooded our system. If you add actually about a meter of sea level, which is very plausible if we don't change by the end of the century, then it means that every other winter storm, a typical winter storm, gives you a 2-meter storm surge. Right. So if you have 2 meters plus 1 meter of climate change, then we're actually, if we didn't do anything, it would be like a Sandy every other year. We are doing something, and that's the adaptation side of things.
Which is really critical, and I think you kind of nailed it on the head. I view it on I frame it a little bit differently. Energy, production is from an industry that's used to being regulated, right? All those power plants are used to being regulated, whereas people driving cars are not so used to being regulated and told where, how often they should be driving, what kind of car they should be driving, things like that. So it takes a lot more to have people make changes. So there is a little bit of how do we encourage people to make those changes, and Build Back Better provides, as you noted, big incentives for that, including
I think it's incentives. I guess coming back to that personal responsibility, I think I'll say it's frankly, it's exhausting, right? I mean, we've all just gone through 2 years of a pandemic. Right. It's hard to keep track of all these things every day. And I think that the idea would be when I go to buy a new car, or when I'm looking at a new home, if the climate impacts were already in the price, and I saw 2 cars, car A is cheaper than car B because car A is actually better for the planet, I shouldn't have to think about is which one's better for the planet. I should be like, oh, well, car A is clearly better. It's cheaper, and that's part of a lot of this is it's market solutions that either incentivizing, so there's reduced taxes on this, or if you put a tax on carbon, which is another game, we won't talk about that today. It's making it easier for us. I think it's exhausting. We shouldn't have to decide that, and then electricity, we don't get a choice. It comes to us, right? But you're right, that is an industry that's more regulated and more centralized, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think you've touched on this a little bit, but why is the president's goal of emissions reductions so important, right? We know that Build Back Better Act is based on these emissions targets. So we'd love to have a better sense of, if you have an idea about why he picked the number of 50 to 52%.
Okay, yeah. The 52% number, which seems like a very precise. Again, this comes back to that science of, what are the emissions we can have for a given scenario that we want? So if we're aiming to make climate change not too severe, so hopefully at 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, about 3 degrees Fahrenheit there, 3-4. How many emissions can we have? And the way I think of it is, it's almost like just a family budget, right? It's like if I want to save for something, or I have this much money in income, I can spend $100 a day. And that's my budget, right? And if I want to make sure that I have enough money at the end of the year, to build that new thing I want in my house, or a vacation, hopefully a climate-friendly vacation, I have to make a target of how much money I can spend, right? And so I see it this way: we're really saying, okay, if we want to stop climate change from being more than 2 degrees Celsius, this is our budget. We've got to meet this budget, and that's where that 52% comes in. It's part of a commitment that the U.S. has made to getting our emissions down, but it's really getting us on track for that target. And it's kind of like our budget, that if we don't start saving this year, if we wait 10 years and then try to save, it's going to be that much harder, right? So that's part of I think anything we do now has a really big impact, where if we wait, it just becomes that much more expensive, that much more harder, And what really frustrates me is I do think of this as we're kicking the can to our kids, who are really going to have to deal with that. And I mean, not even your own personal kids, but the next generation. Yeah.
Of course. So do you think those are the main issues if we miss that target of 52% reduction, is it becomes more expensive and harder to achieve, or are there other other ramifications if we miss that target? Okay,
yeah, so the ramifications are one, yeah, so either we're committing to more warming, we're making it harder, much harder for people 10, 20 years down the road to mitigate climate change. But I think there's actually even more of an impact in that. So part of it is because it's a collective action. It's beyond just the U.S., right? We're not the only emitters. We have a big share of it. But if we're not signaling that we take it seriously in America, it's kind of hard to expect other countries to do that as well. So I think that you amp it up. If we miss our target, I think it's really giving less incentive for the rest of the world to do this. And so that it's kind of a multiplier. If we can get our house in order, that's really important before we can really tackle the problem on the international level. The other thing I think is that, the existing technology we have now, like Build Back Better, there's nothing magic in it, right? It's doing stuff we know how to do. We can do that. I think we can take care of climate change for the next 20, 30 years. When I think about like 100 years from now, like we don't have the technology to do that. We're going to need new innovation. And that takes time, right? And so if we don't start innovating now, we're not going to find those new solutions. So that's the other cost to not acting now. If we don't have an aggressive target on emissions, once you do that, it means basically emissions cost. And then there's a lot of money to be made by making up better solutions, either to get to low emission technology, better efficiency. That innovation is going to be set off. The free market's going to see that signal. And so that's why I think, again, it just piles up. If you wait 10 years, we've lost 10 years of innovation. And we've done that much, we're that much deeper in a hole, right? Our budget's that much worse when we get to at the end of this. So yeah, so I think it is really important that we start now, and we have to be aggressive. Yeah.
So as a climate scientist, what would you like to see happen in the next 5 to 10 years to try and stop or slow down climate change?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, this is getting outside of my expertise, but it seems to me that my understanding is really that the main thing we can do right away is the energy sector. Okay. It's the one we have the most control over. It's regulated. They're used to regulating it, and they also know energy. So I think we really need to decarbonize the energy sector quickly, and at the same time working on towards the transportation side. So building the infrastructure for electric cars and other fuel efficient vehicles. But again, electric cars don't help if you don't have clean energy. Sure. So I really target on that. It seems to be the next 5-10 years. Right. And unleashing again innovation, which I think America has been very good at some things. I think innovation is one of the things we do as a country has been really well. And I think if we make this is a serious problem. This is a money problem where you can make lots of money. Let's do it. Let's get the startup companies, even traditional companies are going to get involved too. So I feel like those are the two things I'd like to see is really reducing on the energy side and the transportation, and then on the innovation side.
Makes sense to me. Mm-hmm. So when people think about climate change, they think about melting ice caps and polar bears and impacts on glaciers, as we've talked about a little bit earlier. Mm-hmm. In what ways, other than severe storms, do you think that climate change is presenting itself here in New York? Mm-hmm.
Yep, I think I touched on these. So one is the sea level rise, which I guess is related to those melting ice caps. Right. New York, particularly New York City, is very vulnerable, right? We're sitting right at sea level. So that's going to be one of the big impacts. The other is just heat waves. Heat waves kill. And then increase. One, they're dangerous. Also, they really stress our energy grid, right? So if you have more heat waves, there's more of a chance for the brownouts and the blackouts that we've seen in the past. So those are some impacts. I think upstate, a lot of the impacts we've seen is this extreme precipitation. And this is one of the things that we're actually really confident about climate science because it's basic. When you're in the winter, that's when it's dry, right? Chapped lips, everything. Cold air just can't hold as much moisture. And every degree, it turns out Celsius, you get the air can hold up to 70% more moisture. So as you move to a warmer world, if you 2 degrees doesn't sound like too much, but that's 7 plus. It's about 15% more moisture. Storms have 15% more precipitation. And it's those extremes that we've been seeing, right? We broke 2 records in New York City with these hurricanes. And upstate, we spent our summer in Walton. And there was the month of July was just intense, just thunderstorms, normal thunderstorms. But you get a couple of them in a row, it washed out the road up the street. And I think that preparing for that is something that we're going to see.
Sure. And you're right. We broke records actually 2 weeks in a row, basically, mm-hmm. with Henri mm-hmm. and then Ida, sort of back to back right there. Mm-hmm. What would you say to people who deny the impacts of climate change or who are skeptical of science? Like, how would you work to convince them of the severity of the climate crisis?
Yeah, it's a hard question, and my understanding is a lot of people who are who don't want to accept climate change or more willing to deny it, it's often because of the implications go against the grain, right? And I do understand that. I think that if you think of a conservative mindset versus a more of a liberal progressive mindset of sort of collective action versus individual responsibility, and a lot of the solutions to climate change sound like regulation, the nanny state telling you what you can eat, what you can't do. And I understand that goes against the grain. So one of the things I think is first, just look at the evidence. I mean, it's becoming more and more clear, especially the forest fires. Several friends of mine, a friend of mine, his father's house was burned down in a forest fire in Canada this past year. I mean, we're seeing the impacts. And then also, I think that climate change is not just really about this nanny state. I think of it as we have to be stewards of the planet, and thinking of future generations, and conservative in the meaning of conserving. It would be actually, there's a lot of bad things we want to avoid. Let's be conservative and avoid these constraints. And I do think that the true solution is going to come out of innovation. So that I think that the free market, individual responsibility, that's where a lot of these ideas, that's where we're going to get saved from. It's not just going to be the state telling you what to do. But we have to unleash those, in business, we want to be smart, right? If there's money to be made, we're going to do it. But if it's not clear that I can make money by protecting the climate, I'm not going to do that. The last thing that is important is it is a national security issue. And I understand for some people they care more about national security, maybe more than domestic. A lot of the wars we expect in the next century are probably going to be climate related. Like a lot of the conflict in the Sudan, for example, it was scarcity of precipitation, forcing people to move into different regions and causing conflict. And I think that if we ignore that these are going to become more and more severe. So there's an existential risk there. And part of climate change is also reducing our dependence on fossil fuel, a lot of which comes from other countries, right? So we can be more independent. Clean energy is local, and it gives us actually more independence. So there are shocks in the system, for example, in oil in the Middle East, that we give the U.S. more independence. So I think partly I say is you got to emphasize the parts that might resound more for someone who has a more conservative mindset. There's also just a lot of misinformation out there that I regret, and I it's hard. So I think it's going to have to have a person-to-person talk. I guess is the way you change things. But
Great. All right. So to wrap things up, are there any for everyone sitting at home who may not know much about climate change? What are some key takeaways you would like to share with them?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. Well, I guess the first, the climate really is changing. In the words of scientists, it's unequivocal. We can see it. We've observed it, and we know it's really being caused by changes by people, anthropogenic forcing. Okay. So that's the first thing. It's happening. It's real, and we have to deal with it. But I find that sometimes, when you get all lost in the numbers, it almost feels hopeless, particularly as an individual. Like, what can I do as a person? And as a scientist, all we worry about is uncertainty. Like, oh, well, are we made a mistake here or not? But it's clear to us that the biggest uncertainty is what we do, right? Is how many emissions? Do we go under a business as usual future where the emissions just keep going up, or do we go on a future where we really do our best? We give it our best shot. And I think that's the uncertainty. That's what we have control over as a society. And I want to give some hope. We don't need any magic technology. We can do it with what we have today to solve climate change for the next 20 years. And I think that's what Build Back Better is about. It's like saying, okay, this is what we have. Let's use it. We can make a difference. We can make a meaningful difference that you will see. And I really think this is it's about our children. That America, we've always prided ourselves in making sure that our kids have more opportunity than us. And I think on the climate here, we are failing that miserably. We are going to be giving our kids a world, and the world is not going to end. Climate change is not that, but we've got tons of infrastructure that's sensitive to climate change. And by not responding to that, not by adapting and mitigating, we're going to be forcing our kids to deal with this. And then that's not what we want to do. So that's to me is that one, we can do it, but that this is really about doing something for the next generations.
Great. Well, I love that optimism and hope that we can actually take action to address climate change and leave the world at least a better place, or at least a less dangerous place for our next generation. I think that is really important. And why, we're advocating to try and get Build Back Better passed this year so that we can be doing some of those things you talked about earlier, which is transitioning to clean energy, transitioning to clean transportation, making sure that we're transitioning how we make stuff, as you would say, into something that's cleaner and less impactful, and also making sure that we're investing in the resilience of our communities and in our infrastructure so that it's better prepared for the impacts of flooding, of the increased precipitation, and of heat, and our communities as well as and putting people back to work. So I appreciate your time today, and we thank you for your insights. And we hope to talk to you again soon. Again, we've been joined by Dr. Gerber of New York University, a climate scientist. Thank you so
Okay,
much.
thank you very much. It was a pleasure to talk. Yep.
Likewise.